Hello, and welcome to the MotherNet podcast. This project has received funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme under grant agreement number 952366. And today is my pleasure to introduce my two wonderful colleagues, Professor Valerie Heffernan and Dr. Maya Bodin, who both work on a complex and very contemporary topic of regretting motherhood. But before we start, I would like to briefly introduce, first of all, Professor Valerie Heffernan, who is Professor of Literary and Cultural Studies and head of the Maynooth University School of Modern Languages, Literatures and Cultures. Her interdisciplinary research interests encompass 20th and 21st century literature, feminist theory, and cultural studies. Her current work critically analyzes how motherhood is represented in contemporary European literature and culture. And from 2014 to 2016, she was principal investigator of a research project entitled The Cultural Transmission of Motherhood in Europe, a case study. Valerie has published a chapter and an article on the topic of regretting motherhood. And Maya Bodin is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center of Medical Humanities at Uppsala University. She's a midwife by profession and a PhD in reproductive health. Her research is interdisciplinary as well and deals with reproductive decision-making and parenthood ideals. And she combines perspectives from reproductive medicine, gender, and sociology. She's currently working on a study about parents who regret having children, where ideals of good motherhood stands out as an important theme. So I have to say that to me, the concept, like those two words, regretting and motherhood, used together meaningfully, without and in the middle, was something that I didn't think was possible. I didn't think that those two words together could make any sense or could be used side by side in a meaningful way. But I have heard of this phrase, regretting motherhood, for the first time in 2016, and it was in the context of a book called Regretting Motherhood, a study by this Israeli scholar, Orna Donath. So could you maybe give us a little bit, Valerie, maybe you could give us a little bit of a context, how you came to discover what this was and what makes it so topical now? Why do we talk about it now?
Okay, thank you, Egla, and thank you for inviting me along today. So Orna Donath's first article about the concept of maternal regret was published in 2015 in the Chicago-based journal Science Journal of Women and Culture. And her study encompassed interviews with 23 mothers who said that if they could go back, knowing what they know now, they would not choose to become mothers again. And this concept, as you say, it's not something that's often talked about in the public arena, or at least it wasn't up until this point. The idea that a woman could regret the decision to become mothers. And it's often perceived as a declaration of somehow lack of love for the children that she's had. What Donath emphasized in her study was that these women, these 23 women, all said that they love their children, they love the children that they have, but they find it difficult to relate to the concept of motherhood and the roles, the responsibilities, the expectations placed on them as mothers. And I think what Donath was arguing most strongly for was recognition that regret does exist, that it is possible for a woman to regret the decision to become a mother, and that it should be possible to talk about that. A woman should not be condemned for professing her regret of her decision. we are very forgiving of regret in pretty much all other contexts. So why do we not understand and recognise and appreciate that a woman might regret that decision, that very important decision? And I think what Donath did was make it possible to talk about the concept of maternal regret. And in my own work, I suppose I've looked at the response to that in the media and in social media. I think she opened up a Pandora's box in a way, but she made it possible to talk about, or for women to bring to light their feelings of regret.
Maya, how did you come to this concept, and why? I mean, what do you think makes it so topical?
Well, I first started to hear things in my empirical data, like other interviews that I made with young people who were thinking about starting a family, and they said things like, "Oh, yeah, I'm not really interested in having children, but you know, you should do this, and you can't regret the decision." So several times I heard this like myth, what to call it now, that we know that people actually regret. But it was a phrase like, you can regret an abortion and you can regret not having children, but you would never regret having children. So yeah, I heard this several times in different kinds of interviews, and yeah, it made me interested in looking further into this subject, to see why can we say this with such a strong like truth in it, that you cannot regret, well, while there are obviously people who regret. And what I've done now is to look at what people write online, and I found that this topic has actually been discussed long before Anna Donath wrote her paper.
Right.
So I think also the online forums have opened up for a different kind of discussion on motherhood.
I mean, we will talk about your work a little bit more in a minute, but I was just struck by this phrase that both of you have used now, the decision to become a mother. How much of a decision is it? Is it always a decision? And has this come up at all in your research?
I think, if I'm not wrong, the statistics show that 1/3 of pregnancies are unplanned. So decision is very much in inverted commas. I mean, when we make that decision, often it comes much, much earlier than the actual decision to start a family now. So it's more about the move towards this stage in life, or the I suppose imagining what it might be like as well to have children. We all have images and expectations of what it might be like to be a mother, and what happens when the reality of that jars with what you expected. But yes, I agree with you. This decision it's a problematic idea, because it implies a sort of a deliberateness that might not necessarily be there.
I think this also differs a lot related to context and time over time, because in Sweden now most pregnancies that don't end up with an abortion are highly planned, like most of them, according to different studies.
Okay.
And it's very accepted to have an abortion as a teenager, for example, and it's an ideal to have a very planned pregnancy. Like everything should be super planned. So right now I think it's a lot about decision making in the Swedish context, like to make this really conscious decision about starting a family, like if, when, how, with whom, how many, like all these things. But I've also talked to older women who had different decisions to make. Like they had to choose more between either becoming a mother or having a career, for example. So for them, it was also a decision, but not so detailed in that way. It was more like, should I do this and leave my career or not? But they were also talking from a quite privileged position, of course. So, yeah, it's not a decision for everyone in the same way.
Yes.
Could I come back in on that, just because as a cultural studies scholar, I suppose I look very much how we make our decisions within a cultural context. And one of the things that has been discussed in the literature previously is the extent to which parents make that decision as an autonomous choice, because we live in culture, we live in societies that we are bombarded by images, by ideas of motherhood from a very early age. And the extent to which that decision is actually ours, an internal decision, is really, really questionable when we are, our decisions are shaped by the society that we grow up in. So even that complicates this idea of a choice or of a decision. Often with regard to motherhood, there is this narrative of choice that is the dominant narrative. And the question to which that is truly a choice is something that I think is much more open, actually.
Well, you were talking about ideals. I was struck very recently. I saw a little girl. She might have been, I don't know, 7 maybe, and she was carrying a baby carrier, a doll, in a sling. And I'd never seen that toy before. I'd seen, I don't know, pram toys or whatnot. So anyway, those ideas, they're deeply ingrained, down to the industry, what we give our children to play with, and they're imperceptible, those sort of inculcation of the ideals or expectations of what motherhood looks like or feels like even. And you were both mentioning the sort of the cultural context. So I wonder, the fact that regretting motherhood is now a hashtag, is a discussed issue, is something that we now explore, you research. I wonder how and to what extent this is all related to other social movements, norms, ideologies. Is it a Western idea? Do we come across this in other cultures as well? I don't know who would like to go first on this.
I will sort of preface what I'm about to say by emphasizing that my research focuses predominantly on a European context. I know there are scholars who've worked on regret beyond the European context, for example, in South Africa or in Japan. But my research is focused predominantly on Germany. My article that was published also with Science Journal together with Catherine Stone of Warwick University, focused on the impact of the regretting motherhood debate in the German context. And this was something really that landed in my lap when I had that Irish Research Council funded project from 2014 to 2016. In 2015, I was preparing for a large conference that we held at Maynooth University on motherhood and culture. And in April and May of that year, there was a really quite heated debate in the German media and on social media about Donat's research. A journalist called Esther Goebel had published an article in one of the major newspapers, the Süddeutsche Zeitung, about Donat's research. And this provoked a lot of discussion in the public arena. And one of the things that Catherine Stone and I were asking was, why Germany? Why did an article published in an American English language journal create such a furore in Germany, of all places? And we began to look to see how the debate was shaped and molded to the German context, and to some ideas about motherhood that are prevalent in Germany, some expectations about motherhood, and also to some social debates about the lack of support for mothers that was perceived, at least by mothers in Germany. I think we would look at the kind of infrastructural arrangements that are in place in Germany. There has been in particular in recent years, since 2007, there's been an increase in supports for childcare in Germany, and maternity leave supports, things like this, a whole range of supports introduced. But the cultural ideas about motherhood are very much embedded, and they go back a lot further into the past. And the expectations placed on mothers still very much relate to cultural ideals of what makes a good mother and how a mother should and can negotiate her work life with her family life, and so on and so forth. And a lot of German mothers were really feeling the pressure, are really feeling the pressure, and this debate spoke to them. And a lot of German mothers took to social media to at least express understanding for how a mother might feel regret, how a mother might experience either temporary or longer lasting regret. Mm-hmm. We've also looked at other contexts as well. A second article on international responses to regretting motherhood.
Maybe we'll come back to that.
Sure.
But yeah, I was just wondering, what was your sense of what is the sort of the context in terms of ideological debates or the bigger social context?
Yeah, I wanted to look at the Swedish case in particular because we have this fantastic support system for parents, and parental leave for 1.5 years, and gender equality ideals, and the father should take as much responsibility as the mother. So that's why I was interested in looking at, well, does it change anything? Like why you regret your child, or how you deal with it, or like the reasons, are they different from other European countries? But I think that we realized when we had this talk a couple of months ago with the different researchers from Europe that the reasons are quite similar, even though we have this strong support system in Sweden for parents. But yeah, the struggle is usually to combine family and work, because you're supposed to be like 100% in both places, like perfect mother and perfect career person, and you don't have enough time to be both.
The ideal is to be perfect, and well, yeah, it's a very neoliberal ideal, isn't it? A very Soviet ideal, I have to say as well. So just in terms of the seminar that I know you both held or participated at, can you just say a few words when it took place and what was discussed? And then the second question is, of course, what are the reasons? What are those reasons that even though the cultural contexts are different, but the reasons are similar? So anyway, let's start with the seminar that you organized and discussed this in.
So it was a symposium that was organised at the University of Uppsala in April of this year.
In Finland?
In Finland, that's correct, yeah. There are two researchers in Finland, Armi Mustosmäki and Tiina Sito, who they've worked on regret in the Finnish context and published on that. And I organised a seminar in collaboration with them. Armi Mustosmäki was the main person involved in that, and we invited Maya and a number of other researchers working on various different cultural contexts to talk about their research on regret. So we had some researchers talking about, for example, Poland, South Africa, Japan, Sweden, Finland, and Catherine Stone and I talked about both Germany and then our research on the Spanish context and on the Anglo-American context more broadly.
Thank you. So what are the reasons why people feel regret?
And there are so many reasons, I would say, from what I have read and what I've heard. It's usually quite complex combination of several factors. It's rarely just one thing. So yeah, I often hear that it can be a combination of having a quite intensive child, for example, and then feeling like a bad mother who can't really do the best of the situation with this very intense child, and you have too little support from your partner, or bad communication with your partner, so you can't really express what you need, and the partner might not support you as much as you want, and it might also be an economical problem, And yeah, so usually it's a combination of things that add up together until the point that you feel like, I can't do this anymore. I wish I could go back in time and have my old life back.
Would you have anything to add to that?
Well, unlike Maya, I don't work with mothers. I'm not a sociologist, so my research has been more at a distance, looking at the picture that emerges in broader terms. And what I see is there are individual reasons related to women's individual lives, and then there are broader social reasons to do with a lack of social infrastructure. Certainly what Catherine Stone and I have noticed in our research is that it seems to be at least more readily understandable in certain countries where there is not a strong infrastructure for mothers, that there's more a sense of understanding and acceptance that it is conceivable that a woman might regret motherhood. For example, on our research on the Spanish context, we found that the debate about regret was integrated again into other debates, feminist debates, about the lack of support for women more generally to negotiate careers and family, but also specifically mothers.
So I was just thinking about what you have been saying about motherhood being a choice and contemporary ideals of the expectation that we expect motherhood to be a choice, and how much of a burden that can be, because we expect of ourselves to be in control of our decisions and to make good decisions in life. And then if we make bad decisions, of course it's hard to acknowledge, it's embarrassing potentially. We have a sense of failure that we made a bad decision. So perhaps sort of allowing ourselves to think of motherhood as not only a choice, but just an existential aspect of part of life might be helpful. I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I think most people have that expectation that having children is part of life that's sort of unquestioned. It's just something you should do, and that will be good for you or your life, give meaning to life, or actually it is the meaning of life. But then when they have the child, they just feel really shocked maybe by how difficult it actually is to be a mother and to live up to so many expectations on motherhood. So there's this ideal image, and where you expect like unconditional love, for example. And what is that? Like, can you have that? And I mean, close relationships are often not unconditional. So you're forced to reevaluate so many things when you become a mother, I think. A lot of existential thoughts come up, and it gets difficult.
You alluded earlier on to the idea of failure as a mother, Egla, and I think that this is another, again, perhaps it links into a neoliberal idea, but what does success as a mother mean? What does failure as a mother mean? Why do we associate those concepts? I mean, surely if getting through the day and everyone being reasonably happy is what we might hope for, but there is this perception that in order to succeed as a mother, you have to be happy at all moments of every day, and that's a really unrealistic idea. Who is happy, permanently happy with any decision, again in inverted commas, that they make? So I think that we need to start moving away from these concepts of success and failure as the markers of motherhood. I don't think they're helpful concepts.
Yeah. Be it a choice or not, we just can't go about judging motherhood in this way. So anyway, just to go back to your original research, right? So could you just tell us a little bit more about what you actually do in your research, because I understand that you approach the subject in two very different ways. You talk to actual human beings and you look at the sort of cultural debates. So just to give a little bit more detail as to how you go about your research.
Yeah. So first I studied the online forums that I chose in the Swedish context. So I chose two forums that have been widely used during the past 20 years. But one is more like male and the other one is more female, both like who are writing and the kind of style people are writing in. So I wanted to look at both because I'm interested in regretting parenthood, not only motherhood. So then I've just read all the threads that are about regretting becoming a parent, and analyzed it with content analysis, like to find different themes, things that people have in common, like why they regret it and how they feel about it, and like what other people say about this and so on. And then the next thing was that I interviewed parents who felt regret, like long-lasting regret, not just 5 minutes a week or anything like that, but more like strong, longer-lasting feeling of regret. And most of them are in their 30s and 40s and have young children, but some of them are also older, like 60, 70, up to 80 years old. So they have quite different perspectives because of having children at different times in history, and for some it's very close, like they're really in the middle of this mess of taking care of a baby, while the oldest ones their children are 40, 50 years old, so a lot of things has happened since. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So is there any, in terms of gender, for example, do you notice any differences?
Well, the first thing is that it's been difficult to recruit men. I expected it to be more easy because in one way it's more acceptable for men to leave the family, for example, or historically it's been like that. So I thought maybe more men would recognize themselves in the advertisement that I made for the study. But no, it's been really clearly that it's women who feel like this ad is directed towards them. So that's interesting. So I don't have that many men in my study, so I can say I can't generalize related to gender, but there are men who are really trying to live up to this gender equality ideal, who feel the same kind of pressure as some of the women in my study. So that exists, but it's also men who became parents without wanting to, because they didn't really have a say in the decision about having an abortion or not. So that's not really the case among the women I've talked to, because the woman is the one who decided in the end what to do with the pregnancy. So that's also a possible gender difference. But interestingly, about half of the women I have interviewed, they say that they never had a longing to become a mother. So they go back to this, saying like, I never played with dolls. I was never interested in babysitting. I never felt the urge to have a child. And then I was just, I did it anyways, because that's the normal thing to do. Mm-hmm. But they come back to this, that they didn't really have the for children from the start. So it's like semi-involuntary parenthood.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And why, could you just tell us a little bit more, although you have touched upon this, why did you decide to focus on both genders rather than only on mothers? Because the phrase is regretting motherhood.
Well, there are different reasons. Both that there are not that many other scholars who study regretting parenthood. And also, as I said earlier, that I wanted to look at this, gender equality context where the fathers are expected to do the same thing as the mothers when it comes to taking care of the children and so on. So, yeah, I wanted to be able to look at the similarities and differences here and how it works in real life. Yeah.
So, are there any sort of initial findings that you would like to share?
Well, something that I didn't mention earlier about the reasons. There are more reasons than just not being able to manage the day. It's also like the climate issue has come up as the reason.
Climate change.
Yeah. And that they feel now that this was really a bad decision to have a child, that the future is uncertain, what will happen to the world, and what kind of life will my child have in the future? Was it really responsible of me to put this baby into the world when the world is just, falling down? So that's interesting, I think. And also, I have talked to both the mothers and fathers who have been in violent relationships. So that also makes it a bit different, because they more regret having had a relationship with that person, and that this person will exist in their life and in their child's life forever.
So is this mothers or fathers?
Both.
Oh, right, irrespective of the gender. Okay, I see.
So they are really sorry for, that this person will be in their life.
And in the child's life, the child will never have a different father or a different mother.
Exactly.
Fascinating stuff. And I would like to now turn to you and to just ask you how you go about your research, because my ideals with sort of lived experience, rawness of what it feels like. Your approach is very different.
Funnily enough, there is an overlap in that Catherine Stone and I also looked at online fora as a starting point, particularly because our initial interest was why the debate had really just taken off in Germany, and it was happening primarily on social media at that point. We tend to, rather than focusing on individual stories, look at the broader picture, as I say, the multitude of voices, and what does that tell us about the cultural context, and what other research has already been, published to describe the cultural context that might contextualize this debate, so how we can understand this debate as part of a broader development, a broader cultural development as well, and then comparing both a historical approach, how we've come to this point, but also how the debate in Germany compares to debates in other cultures as well. So very much a broad focus looking at how this relates to other cultural debates.
So I was going to ask, could you maybe give us a little map of, what are the different responses? Which countries in Europe had the biggest response, why that might be, how the responses are different in the UK, say, or Ireland, and Germany?
Yeah. Well, again, I have to be upfront and say I haven't looked at every culture in Europe in detail. What I would say is, when Donna's research was initially published in 2015, the debate, as I say, was focused on Germany in 2015 initially. It made it into the papers in Sweden, in Spain, in Germany and Switzerland, though and I'm going on memory here, as I remember it, in Germany and Switzerland it was more looking at, in Switzerland and Austria, it was looking at the debate in Germany and, oh, look what's happening there. So it was more of a fascination with what the debate as it was emerging in Germany. What we have found is, when we looked at the Spanish debate after the Spanish translation of Donna's book came out in Spain, was that this was integrated very quickly into cultural debates there and seen as part of a broader debate, and therefore not quite as shocking within the Spanish context. And we linked that to other discussions in Spain, again in social media and in the broader media landscape, about the inordinate pressures placed on mothers with a lack of social infrastructure to support the negotiation of work and family life. In the Anglo-American context, it's very difficult to be specific there because media moves very quickly between different cultural contexts. So if something is published in America, it might reappear in the UK, or it might reappear in Australia, and of course the context is different in each case. So it's difficult to kind of draw broad inferences there. I would say in general terms, it doesn't seem to have had as much impact in the Anglo-American context as in other cultural contexts. There have been in those countries, other similar debates that the Regretting Motherhood was linked to. For example, in the UK, it was linked to a story that had been published previously where a mother had spoken in an interview to a tabloid newspaper about her regret of having two children, and so this was brought up within that context. And this woman, Isabella Dutton, had been heavily criticised in the press for this interview. So that was brought in. So in many cases, it was linked up to other debates that had happened within those cultures. But as I say, because of the way in which media moves around in the Anglosphere, it's difficult to pin it to a particular cultural context there.
Would you say that it's, in your view, is it it's something that clearly has existed forever for various reasons? I wonder whether the current focus on it, do you see it as a positive development or as a negative? Because I've heard opinions, people saying, well, if you talk publicly about motherhood or parenthood in very negative terms, nobody will want to have children anymore, and it will be so. I don't know, what's your view? You have looked at this really closely and spent some time with it now.
I think there's a huge cultural anxiety about that idea that people will stop wanting to have children. And I think it sets parameters for what we can speak about in public and what we can't speak about in public. And so I would view this debate positively, because it should be possible for people to express negative emotions about their experiences of parenthood. And this may actually be a comfort to someone who's going through that themselves, to know that others have experienced that as well. They're not alone. That has to be read as a positive thing in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's how we think about other issues, like mental health issues related to other things that we should talk about, and that will be a relief, and to normalize things. That's positive. But in this case, it's not really seen as positive. I think at least in Swedish media, the past half a year, it's been a quite intense debate about this. Like, you shouldn't talk about it, is the conclusion, because it will only hurt the children. And you need to, care for the children and the rights of the children and so on. And to me, that's not really a true issue here, because all the parents I've talked to, they would never tell their children about this. They just need another grown-up to talk to and just get it out. And the ones who actually have talked to someone they know, or a psychologist or something, or used online forums, they feel better afterwards. Mm-hmm. So it's not their children they are going to tell. Mm-hmm. So I think it's been a bit strange, the discussion in Sweden lately.
Well, but if they talk about it publicly, then their children will also potentially find out. And I just wonder, I don't know, I have no idea whether, is it really such a harmful idea to the children. Maybe the children are, especially if they're grown up. Of course, if we, you know, we shouldn't probably be talking about this to young babies, but you know, adult people should be, I don't know, accepting of the complexity of the world, and I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, I guess it's also about how you talk about it, of course, and when and so on, because there are people writing in these forums also saying that I know that my mother regrets motherhood, and I totally understand her, and it hasn't made our relationship bad, or I don't feel hurt about this, because it doesn't have to do with me. It's really about something else, something bigger, and her life. But there are others who don't feel that because they got to know this in a bad way, and their mother might not be a very nice person, you know, not caring for them and so on. So they feel betrayed, or, you know, they like hurt. So I think it depends on when and how, and like, if you had a good relationship.
Yes, Valerie.
In an interview, Donath mentioned that at 2 of her readings, on 2 separate occasions, I think it was women who had approached her, saying that listening, they realised that their mothers had regretted motherhood. And in one case, her mother was still alive, and she said, now I feel I can have an honest conversation with my mother, and this will bring us closer together. And in the other case, she had lost her mother in the meantime. Her mother had passed away, and she said, I feel I can put that to rest now, that I understand, and I have found a certain peace through this. So I don't think that this fear of children finding out is actually, at least, again, perhaps it depends on the circumstances and the context, I don't think it's necessarily founded in reality in that sense. I was interested. There was a photo project published recently by a photographer called Diana Carkland called Undo Motherhood. And in her photos, the women are photographed, their faces are visible, their stories are told and individualized. And in all cases, they say that their children either already know or they will tell them when they're grown up that they regret motherhood. So I'd like to see that as perhaps a step further along in this debate, that maybe we're getting to a point where maybe because we can talk about it more openly, there isn't the same sense of shame associated with it, of failure, of loss, and perhaps there is a way of understanding this as a highly complex issue that doesn't necessarily reflect on the relationship with the child.
And also it all comes back to the expectations, cultural expectations on parents and on mothers. You know, like, what is a good mother? Arguably, it's somebody who makes sure that the child is safe, has eaten, has been educated, you know. This sort of expectation of unconditional love is perhaps too much to ask of every, you know, of every mother, and is it like, it's very interesting. Because regretting motherhood suggests the absence of unconditional love, and that's where the tension, where the anxiety comes from. Why it is such a taboo issue? Why it is such a transgressive idea to admit maternal or I think that maternal regret is much more judged, much more severely culturally than paternal regret, I suspect. What do you think?
That would be my observation as well, based on what I've read. We have idealized maternal love and sacrificial maternal love, saintly maternal love, and it's unrealistic to expect mothers to be saints. They can lose their patience, they can feel regret, they can feel anger, they can feel negative emotions, and they need to be able to talk about that, and they need to be able to see that as a normal part of the mothering process. I have in my research focused very, very strongly on motherhood because, and it's not that I don't think fatherhood is important. I absolutely agree that fatherhood and regret experienced by fathers is very important to look more closely at as well. But the cultural context and the cultural ideals associated with motherhood are very different from those associated with fatherhood. And to look at them together, my worry would be to conflate them, and I prefer to keep them separate and look at them as two separate ideas. I think it's, so my work has focused on motherhood as distinct from fatherhood.
Mm-hmm. Our time is running out, so I just wanted to ask where to now? Where are you going to take this research now?
Well, I'm in the process of wrapping up this project, and I will spend the coming 6 months just analyzing and writing about what I heard in my interviews.
I really look forward to reading your work that comes out of this project. What about you, Valerie?
I'm working on some cultural expressions of regretting motherhood. So, for example, the Corkland photo project that I mentioned, I'm working on a presentation on that and comparing it to a film that was published in 2016 called Regretting Motherhood by two German directors, Merle Grimme and Felicitas Hoffmann. I'm looking at cultural representations of maternal regret.
Is there anything else that you're dying to say and I haven't asked or hasn't been expressed?
I think you've covered everything.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, in that case, thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for sharing your work with us, and good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.